the Ad Podcast. And today I'm super excited about our guest. We've got Richard Yelland, who is a filmmaker. And Richard has kind of coined the term purpose-based content. He has made some really cool films, such as Seeding Change, which is the story about the conscious capitalism movement with brands like Sambazon and Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's. So you're definitely going to want to check that one out. And he also made a film called Floating, which is the Nathan Gocke Story, in partnership with Life Rolls On, about a paraplegic athlete in the surfing industry. And then he also is working on Birth of the Endless Summer, which we'll get into a little bit at the end of the show. But yeah, super excited to have Richard on today. You know, I got into the advertising and media world not because I wanted to make campaigns, but because I wanted to make cool pieces of film that actually moved audiences. So this guy, he's out there doing the dream. So Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. And, you know, it's great to have the opportunity and platform to tell stories and to inspire people. And so just thank you for your interest in film and also the new movement in communications, which is really moving away from these traditional models that we learned at big advertising agencies. And you come up through those channels yourself. I mean, studying film, but also being a student of advertising. Now is the time when all of this is happening. So thank you for having your finger on the pulse, because what we're doing here today is really trying to inspire leaders at these purpose-driven companies or people that want to focus on purpose and how to engage audiences and how to build their audiences and how to make change all at the same time. It's a really exciting proposition. So it's been really empowering for me to be able to get out, talk to people about impact storytelling, give them some tools, and also help them execute films that aren't just brand content anymore, but we're talking about legitimate pieces of entertainment that have film festival runs, that win awards at festivals, that have mainstream distribution, that are being screened in universities around the world with educational distribution. So, you know, it's something that actually is just starting to get talked about a lot. Like you'll have at the recent Dance Film Festival, you have people that are now experts in this area of brand storytelling, and that is where the future is, right? The wall is coming down. So it's a really cool topic. Thank you for taking it on.
Yeah, man, no, I'm super excited. And, you know, you hit a bunch of points right in there, but, you know, I think probably one that's most prevalent is this idea that, you know, audiences don't want to be interrupted anymore. You know, they want to, like, I think the stat is over 40% of people install ad blockers on their browsers. People are subscribing to ad-free models, whether it's social networks, whether having the opportunity to, you know, have an ad-free experience on, you know, X or YouTube or some of these other platforms. You can pay a small fee and just not have to watch ads at all. And then as people are moving, you know, I consume most of my entertainment through SVOD services where I pay money up front so I don't have to watch ads. So more and more consumers are either opting out of advertising entirely or figuring out ways to get around it or pay for a premium experience when they don't have to be interrupted. So with that in mind, why is it more important than ever for brands to create content that people actually want to see? And more importantly, the type of content that you're doing, which is meant to entertain, but also to educate and also inspire?
It's a great question. And this is one of the things that I talk about when I talk about impact storytelling, whether I'm talking to a bunch of CMOs or CEOs at an event like Real Leaders Unite, which I spoke at beginning of February, or I'm talking to students at University of San Diego or Georgetown, is that we are, as creators, competing to so many pieces of content out there every day, so many messages. And so we are competing for that space, right? And so there's like, that's the negative side of the fact that everyone can actually go out and publish and create, is that there's too much messaging out there. So when we're sitting in this position of being able to create long form content on a story arc that's across entertainment, you know, 22-minute blocks or 54 or 56-minute blocks for PBS or 80-minute blocks for feature length, we have the power to really build story and to engage audiences in a way that typically was only reserved for those big Hollywood studios, you know, and then also breaking that down further when you're thinking about story across art like that, and you're also thinking about entertainment, like everyone who's a content creator, whether you're a scientist or you're, you know, the next big thing, you know, and working with all the hottest influencers, you still need that narrative. And you still need to engage, and you still need to build off story, right? And that's going to be where it's at, right? So I think to answer your question, more than ever, we've got to consider, and this is what I say when we start a project, like if we're going to get people to buy a ticket, you know, that's how it has to be, right? You're publishing your stuff for free, they're consuming it for free, but ultimately, unless it's good enough for people to pay for, they're going to just tune it out. So how do we do that, right? How do we think in the short form, 15 second, 30 second, 60 second, also though thinking about like what's the 22-minute, 30-minute TV special, what's the 80-minute feature film? So when we're thinking about story along those lines, that's how we're actually doing it. How do these pieces of content create a narrative across these different channels? How are we going to build viewerships? And also how are we going to be really critical about the message? And that's how we get to impact storytelling. Because when you delve into purpose, rather than like the typical thing on a brand's strategy, which is data points, science, innovation, proof points, you're losing your audience. So where's the story? Where's the reason? And this is what was really cool when I did talk impact storytelling, which we'll get into a little later today. What's your beginning, middle, and end to your story, and what's your reason why? Like, what's the deep reason why you're telling the story? All of a sudden, it shifts off of this data and science discussion and proof points discussion. It's more like what really moved me as a person to do what I'm doing. And you had CEOs in tears who probably hadn't cried since they had their baby, you know. And so it's pretty amazing to see that people don't really understand what a story is, and that it takes a beginning, middle, and end, and also needs a deep reason why at the center of it. So we start thinking about like this with brands, all of a sudden these opportunities open, and we can start thinking about story as act 1, act 2, act 3, and we can start plotting really cool narrative across different channels, right? Starting, you know, and the influencers fit in there, you know, and the short form content and social fits in there. But what is that story arc? And then that story can actually even be the note from the CEO or the CMO to the team, right? If they're all following that purpose. You know, a really great example is Robert Passon. He calls himself the chief wagon officer. You know, him at Radio Flyer.
Oh, yeah.
He's so passionate, and they're a B Corp, right? They're a 100-year-old brand that's a B Corp. And I mean, it's hard to, he's a CEO who's living that purpose, right? And he is really creating an incredible movement around his brand. And that's what I say, you know, his story is taking a mission and he's turning it into a movement. So that's what we try to do, the stories that we're developing for brands.
Yeah, no, I love it. You said so many great things that I want to circle back to, but I feel like it's important to build the narrative a little bit around how you got into this space and your credentials that we kind of got into the beginning. But I think so many of us who went into advertising and the creative industries never really intended to get into that career. You know, guys like me, like I went to film school. I thought I was going to be doing the type of stuff that you were doing, you know, from the beginning. And, you know, I went into the entertainment industry and I worked at the talent agencies and I worked in development and reality TV. And I was part of a team of 5 guys that raised $7.5 million to produce an independent film. And I produced on Oprah Winfrey's Big Give. And I did a lot of really cool things in my 20s, but I never really, you know, found my sweet spot and was able to really earn like a good living at it. And then as soon as I discovered the advertising world, it was like, wow, you can make a lot of money over here applying these skills. And it's not so much of like a lottery ticket style, you know, hope that you make it type of a situation like it was in Los Angeles and in Hollywood. But, you know, I think so many of us got into this field because we wanted to tell good stories and we wanted to flex those skills that we went to film school. So you were in the traditional advertising world. You were a copywriter at JWT. Can you tell me a little bit about your advertising career? But more importantly, when was the inflection moment that you started making films, and how did you break out and start doing the type of work that you're doing now?
That's a good question, because a lot of what I'm doing today, I'm actually tapping the wisdom from those big ad agencies days in New York City. I was working on Madison Avenue with J. Walter Thompson in the 90s. And we're working on huge brands like Kodak and Procter & Gamble, you name it, Unilever, like, close-up toothpaste, but also working on really cool projects like George Plimpton's The Paris Review as well, which keeps us excited as creative people. But as an incredibly talented group of people, and you're working on global brands, you're developing multi-channel communications, print and television for big brands, you're developing copy and things that are being translated in multiple languages. You're learning how you got to create a big idea that can actually translate across countries, and across different mediums, whether it's print and television. Back then, we didn't really have digital, it was print and broadcast. So, we're still like, what's the big idea? But it's like, what is the big story? Because it's the story, the big idea really translates into 30-second TV and print ads, right? But the story, the narrative is how we communicate now through all different types of channels, whether it's digital, short form in social, whether it's cinema, we're putting films in cinemas, or we're on broadcast. Like, you have to be fluent in all these mediums. So, but getting back to your question, is really a campaign that I developed for the Partnership for Directorial America, where I really saw the power of using our tools as creators, as writers, as artists. We brought in photographers, we brought in directors to develop a campaign fighting heroin use for the Partnership for Directorial America. And we saw in the 90s, we saw in the art communities, in the music circles, and you saw it even on the fashion runways, heroin chic. The models looked on the runways, Kurt Cobain, the icon, right? And his heroin use. And you had Bradley Noel, Sublime. There was a heroin chic movement. And so we helped develop a campaign for the Partnership for Directorial America. And we started from scratch, and we brought it to the Partnership for Directorial America, and they were really moved by it. And they said, let's do some research and see if there really is an issue here that we need to address. And they came back to us and said, hey, we want to put this campaign out, and we actually want to get every agency in America involved. And we ended up doing a massive Partnership for Directorial American campaign against heroin use. And we ended up going to Washington, D.C. and working with the Clinton administration on releasing it. And it was a massive effort, which won a lot of advertising awards. But what we saw, what was the coolest thing, was that we won a gold Effie for advertising effectiveness. And the campaign did its job. It actually turned the tide on heroin use and interest in, like, we were able to make change against this problem and what they were calling an epidemic at that time. So I think from that point on, there's that feeling like, hey, we put our storytelling to work. We can make change on a massive scale, right? And we can really make amazing things happen. So when I started my own company, Curtis Birch, in 2000, those ideas were already planted in my mind, that we could start telling stories and making a difference.
Yeah, no, I love that, man. And what did you study in college?
I was a history major. I studied classics. Yeah.
Wow.
Actually, Latin and Roman history. So people say, what are you going to do with that? And I actually think I use it every day because I do a lot of my films and work has been on untold histories, and working over different languages and across different countries. My new feature documentary, The Holocaust Story, and we've been shooting in 5 countries. So it's really great to have a global perspective. And also today in business as well, understanding how the world is thinking is really important. There's a lot of nationalistic dialogues going on in politics in various countries. And I think that we need to think globally, especially when we're talking about the planet's health and how we're going to take care of the planet and the people on the planet, and how we're going to deal with natural disasters and epidemics, and how we're going to solve some of these problems like water and alternative energy. Like, how are we going to address these things? So we need to be thinking globally.
Yeah, no, I love that. What's that quote? Those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it, right?
It's essentially exactly right. I mean, the Holocaust story we're working on is an untold story about music in Shanghai that was passed from the Jewish refugees there to the Chinese. And it's a really powerful story of the healing power of music to bring people together during a really horrible time, and music that is now growing and becoming more influential today. So kind of this beautiful bright spot amidst a really dark moment in human history, and that this music today is now reaching the world's top stages. So that's a film called The Garden Bridge that's coming soon.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you know the history of the brand Club Med?
I don't actually.
So another really fun guy to follow on LinkedIn is a copywriter named Justin Oberman, and he kind of puts out historical. You know, he'll put up a clip of like David Edelman talking to, or like Edelman talking to David Letterman or something like that, and then have kind of a hot take on it. But what I learned about Club Med is Club Med was actually started for Holocaust survivors that were making the pilgrimage from Europe to Israel, and they stopped off in Italy often. And the guy that founded Club Med just basically wanted to create like a beach opportunity for these folks that were coming out of such a horrible situation to spend some time on the beach and rest and relax after having such a traumatizing experience. So Club Med is very rooted in that Jewish tradition of it essentially started off as a refugee, or essentially a escape for people who were survivors of the Holocaust.
Wow. Yeah, it's that is it's one of those things that we, by acknowledging the history, by putting a light on it, and it allows people to move past it, and I've done some work here on our own dark history in America with the film 12 Miles North, the Nick Gabaldon story about the Jim Crow era in America.
Mm.
The sport of surfing and segregated beaches and self-segregated beaches in Los Angeles in the late 1940s. And, I think that how we deal with problems and how we come to terms with them and we move forward on positive footing and we create hope and inspiration moving forward is by telling story and by shining a light and finding those threads that people can engage in and have dialogues around these things. And so this is definitely something that when we're looking at particularly at purpose-driven brands that really have a deep reason for being, whether it's a social, environmental, cause related that's there, is we dig into that purpose and we shine a light on it, and we're finding that connective tissue, that interest level that we can then develop story around it and then engage with consumers. And that is definitely I think where it's exciting, because what we can do is we can not only obviously help brands grow with those 81% of consumers who are aligning their purchases with their values these days, 77% that they want their brands to take a stand on sustainability. We've got to communicate to those consumers in the right way, connect with them, deliver these messages, and let them know, hey, this brand has a solution for climate. Like, support it. You're going to save a forest, or you're going to save a watershed. We got to communicate these things. If we want change to happen, these messages need to come. They need to be delivered really well. They need to engage audiences, build audiences into movements that can then translate to change. And that's sort of what we're talking about. And that's the really powerful tool that we have with impact storytelling. And this is why I say we take a mission and we can turn it into a movement. We can develop story around these really transformational things that have solutions in them, right? And so it's very powerful. It's super inspirational.
Yeah, that's cool. So actually want to hop into what I would consider, your work that addresses that topic most head on, which is the film Seeding Change.
Yes.
So from what I understand, you started off making this movie that was more a documentary about Samazon, right? Essentially, this company that just was on a 20-year mission to evangelize the positive benefits of acai and why people should be eating it. Yeah. But more importantly, it was tied back to a purpose, which is regenerative farming and agriculture down in the Amazon rainforest. And essentially that if companies were not only eating this great antioxidant, or if people and consumers were not only eating this really great antioxidant, very good for you food and making a healthy food choice, but at the same time, they could be supporting a agricultural system and a company that cared about what's happening down in the rainforest.
Yeah.
And then my understanding is that then, that just created a daisy chain of you meeting a bunch of other companies that were in the same space. So can you talk a little bit about that project and, what was some of the outcomes that you saw as far as with the audiences that connected with it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question that way. Thanks for doing the research, because it's really what I talk about when I talk question and answer on this film. They always want to know, like, how did this story come about? And it's a really good example of being a documentary filmmaker or a storyteller or someone who's always digging for the story and then trying to continually shape it or continually improve the story, look for a deeper story or a bigger meaning or bigger reason why. So when we started off this project, Seeding Change, the focus was on that amazing story, which is that Amazon basically created the acai industry. They had this crazy idea to bring it back, and it had to be put on ice in 24 hours. They had to get it to places around the world, and then people didn't even know what to do with it. It's like, well, what do we eat it? Like, so, they had to educate people on what it was. And now you're starting to see, at John Wayne Orange County Airport, you're going to see Amazon, stand there, and that they're going to franchise them around. But these, ultimately, like, it's bigger than that, and that, that they've created an industry. They've helped preserve over 2 million acres of rainforest and counting. They've raised the economic index in these farming regions by 40%. They've built several schools with their fair trade money. They've created a model for business, and there's actually a professor at Indiana University his whole life study is called The Working Forest, and it's about how sustainably managing this Amazon rainforest in Brazil, how, if it's done properly, we can increase the biodiversity of the forest. We proliferate the health of that forest, the quality of those berries, like you said. So the berries are getting, even more healthy with this management. The people in the rainforest are actually continuing to stay in the forest and manage these trees and farm these trees because there's an economic incentive there. The trees are too valuable to cut down. So the clear cutting in those regions they farm is no longer an issue. They just opened another factory. So that's 2.5 million acres. So as we then encourage people to vote with their dollars, you want to actually go and buy the Amazon acai that's protecting that rainforest and that we know is organic, and we can trace that supply chain back to exactly where it came, or do we want to go with sort of that X factor? We don't even know if it's real acai. There's a lot of apple juice in it, right? So, or their energy drink, the guayaki is another story in the film. That we're going to choose this can of guayaki organic yerba mate because this is actually helping regenerate the North Atlantic rainforest versus this can of soda, which is filled with soy that may be the reason that so much of that rainforest is being cut down. But we have a choice as consumers to vote with our dollars, one or the other. So in the investigation of Amazon and like how they actually did what they did, it became clear that it wasn't just their story. And no one really wants to watch a film about a company beating their chest either. And I think that the founders of Amazon, Jeremy Black and Ryan Black, and a few of the other partners who definitely deserve as much credit as they for founding this company, were like, we want to build this company the right way from the ground up. And this is about the rainforest. It's about the people of the rainforest, but we actually don't need, we can't do this ourselves. We don't know what to do. And like, so as they're out trying to tell this idea at the trade shows, they're sitting there alongside Dr. Bronner's. And this is 20 years ago, sitting alongside Numi Tea or Guayaki. And they're all together at the trade shows trying to sell this idea of the triple bottom line, that they're going to take care of people and planet with their businesses. And now 20 years later, as we're telling Amazon's story, it's a much bigger story. As we as a collective of brands, or we as a collective people are trying to solve social, economic, and environmental crises with our business models, we're triple bottom line. We're prioritizing people, planet, and profit. That this is a global movement, and that we're trying to solve global problems, right? And so I think that what's powerful is, and this is a really good example of how we tell stories is that we're digging for that story, that bigger story, that connective tissue, right? The rising tide floats all boats, and that's what, when we're looking at, when we're making the film and we're seeing the stakes of climate change, the wildfires that burned down Jeremy Black's house, or the made me, I was evacuated out of my house. There's so many wildfires at that time, all the changing weather patterns we saw was happening, all over the world, and that becomes the stakes. So what are the stakes? Why are we doing this, right? We're not just doing it for one brand to have success and one brand in one part of the rainforest to succeed. We're talking about all companies and every forest and every social injustice. And so that then, as we're starting to think about, okay, what are the brands across different categories, right? With fashion, who was the first fashion company that really set out to build a fair trade company, Outer Known, right? And they're thinking about alternative fabrics, using recycled fishing nets and recycled carpets for fabrics, or looking at Thrive Market that's looking for where are we going to put conscious products and conscious consumer solutions in a market, so that when I go to that store, I can afford to get incredible organic food at a price that I can afford. Or when we're looking at banking, or we're looking at investments, what are some of the things I need to be thinking about in that world? And obviously, we were talking about food and beverage earlier, so it becomes a bigger narrative, and that's I think a really good question you brought up. Like, how do we look at it from one brand's perspective, and then start telling a bigger story? And I think what's cool when we go work with brands on these projects, we're not looking at just the brand brief, right? Because the typical way is like, what's the brand brief? How am I going to tell a story off the brief? Instead, we're going, okay, where's your story fit into the zeitgeist? Where's your story fit into that global story right now? Why? And then we can start thinking about, who are the nonprofits you're working with? Who are some of the stakeholders in your brand? Who are some of the experts at universities that we're going to involve in this narrative? So we're starting to build from the ground up, and we're starting to look at storytelling not as a brand centric or focused. Sure, we're gonna, whatever story we develop, your product benefits and your science and your data is gonna be the payoff when people dig deeper. That's the proof. But essentially, you and I, why are we talking? What's the interest, right? The first woman at 29 years old, just finished around the world, first solo ever around the world, and her story was so compelling. And it's like, well, it's that day-to-day story of who she are, what she's doing, how she's going through that struggle to make it around the world. That's when we become engaged in her story, not the fact that she's the first to do it or the potential to do it. It's like, what are the stakes? What's the beginning, middle, and an end? So, that's something that we really think about when we're talking about impact storytelling.
Yeah, no, I love that. So you mentioned some really, what I would call, aspirational brands, right? Like, when I worked with Adobe, when they talked about who are the 5 brands that they would love to work with, Patagonia was on that list. There were others that were aspirational, but I feel like a lot of brands aspire to be this way. But even if they wanted to do branded content, or if they had the budget for it, some of the stories that you've told are quite compelling, right? You're saving the rainforest. You've got Dr. Bronner's that has this really, interesting founding story of like, who was the grandfather that came up with the formula, and, what's the packaging, and how did that story tie into the packaging, and then the culture of the company. Like, I know Dr. Bronner's is the first company to allow their health insurance plan to pay for ketamine assisted trauma therapy, and they're very cutting edge, like in the psychedelics movement and stuff like that. But let's be honest, like, your average Fortune 5,000 company maybe doesn't have a story that's that interesting and cool.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, does the brand have to be the star or the subject of the film, or can they just be the partner that's coming alongside you to tell an interesting story that maybe leads into their their culture or their brand pillars or their goals around philanthropy? Like, does the story have to be about the brand, or can the brand just come along and tell a great story with you?
It's many questions in one question. I'll try. Okay, so you got, I think, whether you're Dr. Bronner's or your Bumblebee Tuna, I'm bringing that one up because they had a really bad history in the past of different issues with labor in different countries and overfishing and issues like that. So when we work with them on their developing their storylines, they're trying to obviously do critical work to change some of the ills that they've done in the past, right? So how are they addressing those issues? So what we allow them to do is, by having this narrative that's more story driven, we can talk about some of those things that we might have done wrong in the past. And I think you're seeing a lot of people now, in this space of how are we going to engage, become better people? How are we going to heal? How are our products going to help? Like, this transparency that we're talking about is super important. The minute we can become transparent and start talking about some of the things. So Bumblebee is like, we're gonna actually change all of our packaging. We're gonna spend all this money, which we is going to be a stretch for us this quarter, put this machine in that's eliminating plastic. So from all their multi-packs, so all the plastic from Bumblebee gone. So that's a legitimate investment, and it's a big investment. It's got a legitimate purpose behind it. There's a complete result there. They're also working in developing help for us with a group we've been working with a lot called Sea Trees, where we actually plant trees to offset carbon for our travel footprint. So Bumblebee is doing some amazing things using blockchain. You can trace your catch on a Bumblebee tuna can. So that's stuff that should be communicated in the point of sale, should be communicated on their TV ads, right? And that's where we can go with this. That impact story should be at the center of all communications for whenever you're working around purpose. So that's one side of it. On the other side, people will say, well, I don't have the budget. And I say, well, you don't need the budget. You need a big story, right? And so some of the companies that have the most amazing innovations have the biggest story, and they might not need a lot to get started. The run and gun team is not expensive, and that story can start with someone showing up somewhere and at the UN and making a stand and doing something. So the greatest stories often, like I said, Cole Bauer on Around the World Journey she was live streaming right from her boat, right? So her story's huge. What was her production budget? Microscopic to nothing.
Wow.
That's why I like to say, a lot of people are like, well, all these great films you've done, what's my cost of entry to get a feature length? That's always the big question. But it's like, what I'm really interested in now is like, how can I work with some of these amazing startups that we're seeing at TEDx Planet Stewardship event at MIT? They're going to change the world with their innovations. How can we tell a story for them? Because they're sitting around talking to scientists right now. But if we can get these innovations out to people and tell it in a really compelling way that can actually engage consumers that want entertainment to move them, like this entertainment has the power to do that.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Yeah.
So, you hit on an interesting topic before, which is the idea of voting with your dollar. I think, you talked about some of the statistics within millennials and Gen Z that 66% of them say that they want to support businesses and products that align with their values. How far do you think the average consumer is willing to go as far as voting with their dollars, when maybe we're in a situation where there's, lots of inflation and fears of an economic downturn? Yeah. Like, how far are consumers willing to go? Because, when things are going great, like, yeah, I'll definitely make the extra effort to like reach for the product that I know does cool things that align with my values. But when money's tight, it's kind of like, I got to reach for, the thing that maybe is on sale or this or that. So how much are consumers willing to vote with their dollar, depending on, where we sit as a as a country economically?
Yeah, I think the economic question's always a good one, and it's always relevant. But I would say that what you've seen just from this year to last year, like those numbers have gone up. Now it's like 77.
Wow.
Project Drawdown just did a study, and you mentioned Paul Hawken. That's his nonprofit. That kind of jumped off on his Project Drawdown book, but like, they put out a study saying 77% of consumers now are really wanting to see their brands take a stand on sustainability. So, and then over 50% are willing to pay for it too. So I think what it is an awakening, and so what we're seeing is what I like to say, 2024 is the year of the conscious consumer. That things are really shifting, and like you said, that those newer generations, like because now those options are out there, they're going to research and find those options, right? And so you've got to be working on your purpose-driven solutions within your brands. If you're not already, you need to really be doubling down on that in those commitments, those ESG commitments, the sustainability commitments. For those brands that are already founded on those principles, they're ahead of it. But then it's also communicating it. So, I think that this is something we struggle with a lot in making seating changes. Like, okay, well, let's say they are willing to pay more, right? And maybe this month they're not, maybe next month they are, but ultimately we need to get them educated. So we need to educate consumers on why. And the newer generations are already doing the research. The greenwashing isn't going to work. So, the education piece is huge, like getting more in touch with where our food's coming from, getting more in touch with like the landfills and, all the waste going into landfills, getting educated, the upcycled foods, right? Upcycled Foods Association, the nonprofit, like reusing our food. Food waste is just as big of a problem as the aviation industry in terms of emissions.
Oh, wow. Yeah. What is it? Like 50% of food goes into the trash?
Yeah. So like we need to be educated, and part of the thing with seating change is how can we educate, but also entertain. So I think that, and that's where like, where's that tension? Where are the stakes? Like what's the beginning, middle, and an end? And that's where my loop process comes in, where I'm looking at some of our successful projects, how we built audiences, how we built movement around story across multiple films and working with many brands. How do we build that story in a way that we can take that mission and have lasting shelf life with it? So I developed that loop process, LOUPE, and it's a 3-step process where we work with brands in identifying story. We look at like what their reasons why are. We look at their points of differences. We research those companies. Then we really get to the root of, with all the communications decision makers and founders, like, what's your reason? Why are you doing this? And when you really start talking directly with the people that are communicating and with these companies around purpose, it's like, oh, well, this is, those human reasons why we're doing this gets lost in all the data and science around climate discussion or all the politics around wokeism. It's like ultimately, if we get to the human interests and needs and reasons why we all are rooting for, we all are rooting for the forest. We're rooting for the cleaner oceans. We were always rooting for Martin Luther King when he said, "I had a dream." So how do we get beyond our differences? So drilling into those universal human truths, and is what we're trying to do. And we have to do that as storytellers, already thinking about our audience members out there who are going to pay the price of admission, who want to actually watch our film, not just once, but watch it over and over. We can build audiences, we can build engagement, we build, these people that are passionate about the reason and why we're doing what we're doing and are excited. So we're inspired, we're moving people, we're aligning people behind our purpose. And that's the power of impact storytelling. And that's what I say before we execute, which is that production part of the loop process, which is more the middle part. This is something that, for those that are interested in listening today, I can talk with them offline about. But yeah, that first step is really looking, observing, understanding the L, the O, the U, the first phase of that loop storytelling process, and developing story. And when you have a good story. And it's funny because when I gave this talk to these CEOs at the Unite conference in San Diego at the beginning of February, and these are top impact CEOs that flew in from around the world. I had them write down a story that was meaningful to them, whether it moved them or inspired them to do what they do. It could be anything. And like when people were presenting these stories, they started crying. And that's when we were like, oh, well, this is it. This is what it's all about. Because this is when we're in there interviewing people and the people filming are starting to cry, or I'm getting goosebumps and I'm uplifted to take action. Those are the only reactions we want. And that's how we get people up out of their seats and get them to really go out and make a difference. So, we're trying to make change. We are actively trying to push those buttons, make people feel those things in such a way that we are moving them to go out and make a difference, And so there's technology, which is great, which, we're going to try to implement for our new campaigns where, instead of going to a URL, you can actually scan this. And by scanning this code, you're immediately now taking action. You're delivered to Impact Hub, where, all the impact resources for you to make a difference is at your fingertips. When we were developing CD Change, we were envisioning so many things. We have a website full of resources, but now with the technology, we can actually provide widgets and codes and things where people can actually immediately scan, take action, right? Because once you have them, it's like the minute they click that URL and then they get there, they've already kind of lost it and they're on to the next thing.
Yeah, it's kind of the resurgence of the QR code, right? Like, how do you get people in that moment where they're most uplifted, most energized, and have the most amount of willingness to do whatever is required next, right? I think you also hit on an interesting topic. So you mentioned woke, and to some brands, they may be thinking of that these days as a dirty word, or a dangerous word. You saw what happened to Bud Light. Target is recovering from their first down quarter since the 90s. My guess is that because those brands didn't have the authenticity to talk to the audiences that they were trying to talk to around the campaigns that they were trying to generate, what they actually ended up is they ended up pissing off everybody, both the left and the right, because one group felt like they weren't supporting them enough. And then the other one was offended because they were not, living up to their sensibilities. So now you've pissed off everybody, and now you've got boycotts and stuff like that. So how does a brand who hears the word woke, who maybe gets a little bit scared of kind of dipping their toe into social issues and social justice, how do they kind of tap into that stuff from a place of authenticity where people actually believe that they care about the things that they're talking about?
Yeah, it's funny that I bring this word up because I never do. But I think it's the same point I made earlier that what we had to deal with seeing change when we led with the climate crisis is real, and Paul Hawken has been studying it since the 70s at Stanford. He wrote a substantial book on it, and it's like the science is real, and so and that we need these forests to live, and we need a certain balance to our ecosystems, and how do we address that? And so how are we going to actually talk about this without turning off a whole set of deniers, a whole set of political disbelievers, right? So, and I always say it's really beyond that political discussion. Like, let's get up here and let's talk about the benefits. So I'm glad you're talking about this because the old model was an us versus them narrative, and it was a divisive narrative. It's a narrative that's used in politics right now. So it divides people, and it pits people against each other, and it polarizes people for power reasons. And it's fear-based. There was a narrative around climate and around social justice issues that was that's really reactionary. That was us versus them as well. So with Seeding Change, and I credit the brands that I work with for being part of this solutions-based narrative, because they're like, this isn't about us. This is about solving problems for the world. When we get into that space, it's not about these political discourses. It's not about them. It's about we. It's about our forests. We want the forest. We'd rather be in the forest. We need it. It's a basic universal human need. We need that forest. The clear cut, we don't want the clear cutting. We don't want the plastic in the ocean. We don't want the segregation. We don't want that. You know, humans do not want it. Every human, whatever state you're in, if there's an accident and someone's lying on the side of the road, you're going to help them. Mm-hmm. So we get more in tune with those human values, and that's above the political discussion. So if we're developing story on solution, and we're talking about doom and gloom, we're talking about problem solving, we're recognizing the problem, whether it's racism or social injustice, or we're talking about environmental injustice, or we're talking about issues with the environment we're trying to solve. It's like, okay, that's the doom. The gloom is, what are the solutions that we're going to create to solve that? So that is the opportunity, and that's the narrative that actually engages everyone in the conversation. So I think that's where the sweet spot is, and I think that where we don't have to worry about that, because we did worry about that. We did worry about that with Sea and Change, and I know that people that are watching the latest from QAnon that might be believing it are still like, oh, I want the forest too,
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody wants trees, everybody wants nature, nobody wants microplastics in their water, giving them estrogen. I mean, there are some universal things that I think, even though the politicians may want to think they're issues that divide us, we're a lot more similar, that we all just want a healthy planet for our kids to grow up in and thrive in, and be able to leave to the next generation.
You brought up a good point, though. I mean, going back to your original question, authenticity. So Bud Light and that discussion of, did they overstep bounds? Were they being authentic? Were they being true to themselves? So one of the things that we do before we tell any story is we do a tonality questionnaire with stakeholders in the company. So if we're going to create and write around a brand, we're going to write story around a brand, what's the tone of that brand as a human in the environment? So how does your brand act in a fight? Who's your brand's favorite musician? What kind of sense of humor does your brand have? All these things, and we put it into a tonality statement. So those things are so important. You get to that kind of your brand as a living, breathing human in society speaking. How does it speak out there? And you look at Liquid Death. They have a very specific tone. And I think that humor is right for them, and the kind of humor they have is very, very carefully designed tonality. And I see people from that company talking about, well, there should be more comedy in our communications these days, which I think probably right. But the thing is that there's so many different types of comedy, and it's all about tone, right? There's slapstick comedy. There's ironic or sardonic comedy. There's so many different types. There's Ricky Gervais, like his sense of comedy versus you name it, Seinfeld. So I think that all that comes to tonality, and so I think that whether we're going to be earnest and we're going to be authentic, or we're going to be passionate or emotional, or we're going to actually just like have a laugh. Like this is time to laugh. Like we don't want to talk about anything serious. So let's have a laugh. Like, what's the tonality? And I think it's different for every brand. So I think that that's a really important piece of the equation.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I want to move a little bit into the business model of purpose-driven content, because I imagine there's a lot of advertisers that are maybe watching right now, and they're like, okay, well, sounds cool. I want to make a webisode series, or I want to do a podcast, or I want to actually go for the Hail Mary and I want to make a 1.5 hour feature or an 80-minute feature. Yeah. But what the heck do I do with it once it's done, right? So can you walk us through some of the companion campaigns that surround a successful purpose-driven content campaign? And when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about, what's the PR story that I'm telling the entire time I'm making the project? what's the cut downs that I'm using in my social feed the entire time that we're filming and bringing this project to market? What's the festival circuit that I'm going to take it on, and what awards can I win, both in the advertising community, but also in the mainstream film community as a feature-length doc, or maybe even a feature that's narrative. There's brands like, what was it, Uncle Drew, right? The Pepsi comedy that was literally adapted from an ad campaign that they did back in the early 2000s. So can you talk about some of those things? And then the last part about the business model is, the reality is these films might go out and make money. So they might actually return an investment back to the brand as a piece of content that goes out in the marketplace and finds a home and finds an audience. Now, not every piece of film that you make probably needs to have that expectation, but there is that possibility. So I know that was another mouthful, but can you walk us through some of those particulars?
Yeah, great question, and one that's really super relevant right now, and one that we're pushing on, because I would like to say that we helped over the last 10 years develop a model for working with brands around purpose that actually have involved a piece of entertainment content that could go on a film festival run, that could be licensed for broadcast, that could go to have a premiere on iTunes, that could go beyond, that could actually be distributed as entertainment content to universities around the world. It was always this big question of like, we can never get into universities with our brands, but it's like, so there's so many facets to it. And I think it's really relevant because the people that are working at the forefront of where brands meet entertainment in Hollywood, they are talking about how it's closer than ever to that wall coming down, but there's a lot of educational process. So when we're working with brands, we're really teaching them how a film festival works, because these timelines are way different. For example, we did a pandemic project with Lysol, and by the time we are on the film festival run, they're already off the pandemic and onto new product releases and a whole new brand team. So there's going to be a learning curve with how we're going to make these bigger opportunities line up for brands. So brands that are going to grow on a piece of content, like, for example, Seeding Change, and those brands like Samazon, Guayaquil, Dr. Bronner's can grow on that, because that shelf life of that film's still on a film festival run a couple years later. It was Earth Day 2020. We're screening at schools. We have education release. We have mainstream release. But that's like a longer format, right? Run. That's a feature film. And so, there's definite ways to play it. So what I like to do is, when I'm talking to brands right off the bat, like, what are your immediate needs? And then what's the long-term goals? Mm-hmm. Do everything. We can think about the feature film, right? This is how long it's going to make. They're used to, we could shoot this commercial in the next 12 to 16 weeks. We can have it on air. So there's that. We can also integrate TV campaigns, because that's what we come from, 30-second commercials. What's the 30-second commercial? What's the short form content? But again, it goes back to narrative. So if you have a strong story, you can communicate across all these channels. But we do have experience now delivering feature films with brands in them, and how they can work. And we can also say that if we develop them to our executional standards and to our story standards, and if the brands allow us to do what we do best and kind of take that hands-off approach, like, we trust you as the experts, when we're done, we're going to deliver you a film that actually is a 60-minute piece of content, 80-minute piece of content. It's got the 22-minute format for short form. That's a 30-minute TV slot. We can also do all these great cut downs in short form on social media that can then add up, and can kind of build up to a release of some of these content, other content platforms for the long format pieces. There's a lot of great stuff we can do. And so I think the people like Rick Parkhill that I met at Brand Storytellers, who's been an incredible guy to meet, they're really right there with brands and have the ear with brands, going to Sundance, going to South by Southwest, having their brand showcase, showing brand-driven content that's legitimate, high tier festival quality content, and showing, look, this is what we can do. Because half the battle, I feel like, for us is actually coming in and teaching brands, like, no, if you actually start thinking this way, that $1 million that you're spending to shoot shoot the Super Bowl spot, and then the millions of dollars to buy that spot, you could create an incredible package of content that's actually an entertainment property, like a piece of real estate that you can put out, release through major distribution channels, and that can actually, yes, be not only building audiences and engaging, but then also revenue streams as well, which is definitely, where I think people in at that forefront of brand entertainment and working with brands and trying to have the brands kind of work with Hollywood. That's where they're seeing it, and I definitely see it, and we're ahead of it right now. So brands that are interested, we can help them get there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think of like a great example recently was the F1 series that came out on Netflix. I mean, I feel like that thing basically paved the way for F1 to come to America. Such a groundswell of interest and intrigue, and now it's a huge sport here in America in short order because of a series that was put out on a streaming platform. So it kind of shows the power of that.
Yes, most definitely. So I think, again, coming back to story, when we have a good story and we develop a good story, and that's sort of where that first phase of the project is really before execution. Is really that story development phase, and that like we need to be story hunters, and we need to dig deep and find those great stories. And we're already looking for the stories before we even meet the brands. So we're aware because we're already thinking. I'm already thinking about where my next few projects are going to land, where they're going to be distributed, who's going to want to watch them. Like I said, who's going to want to pay for tickets at the cinema when it gets to the cinema. Which networks are going to buy this for their, stream for their channels? Like, is it a Netflix project? Is it an HBO project? We're already thinking of these things before we even get in the room. So we're thinking about where we're developing stories with brands that we're already thinking of where they're going to place, right? So that's a way different way of thinking, and that's what's really dangerous about. I think there's a lot of buzzwords around impact storytelling, and they're talking about data and science, or they're talking about carbon reduction and keywords. Like those are not those, the dangers of influencer marketing and trend and catchphrase is that that's not story, and that has no value long term. It might be you have that celebrity endorser. It's the quick fix. It's the real great high, like you said, a gateway drug. But what's at the end of it? So just like you need to build a brand, you need to build that story. So I think that those kind of things that, those quick fixes, the influencers, the celebrities involvement, like all that needs to, has its play in a bigger narrative. We're talking about this too. It's like Michael J. Fox, his story about his documentary. It's not about Michael J. Fox, the celebrity. It's Michael J. Fox, the human. That's a story. So that's where your celebrity and your story kind of get a little bit intermixed. But I think a lot of people can mistake catchwords, or because Taylor Swift's involved, that there's a story there, and it's like that is might be a quick fix for some sales and some engagement right here. But ultimately, how are you going to build a story that's going to last? And that's kind of what where we've seen success with our films, like 12 Miles North of Nick Gabaldon Story over 10 years later is still being played, right? There's a National Historic Site in LA based on that film about the first African Americans. That film is just played at our local theater for Black History Month. It's still more relevant than ever as this becomes a more important topic in terms of, sharing the water together as people of all colors in the water, ocean, sharing our natural resources. So, again, Seeding Change is a story that's still getting out and is one that's going to last the test of time, because it's driving a new narrative, a movement around triple bottom line businesses. So how we take missions and turn them into movement through story, that's where longevity and shelf life is. Because we're going to put a lot of money, effort into building these kind of projects, and these so much work and effort to build a great feature film that wins awards. We don't want it to just be cool for 1 year. Like, we want it to be something that people will watch in 10 years. And that's when it's really good,
Yeah, no, I love that. And, it's funny. I think you're right. I think, the influencer marketing world is getting very saturated and everybody's doing it. And to some degree, there's some utility there. You can create a lot of content for social media, etc. But, again, I think it goes back to that authenticity story. Like one brand you absolutely can't deny is Prime Energy drink, right? You've got Logan Paul and KSI launching a energy drink brand that's now on track to, I think, to do 1.2 billion. Okay. And at the end of the day, I think that brand was only successful because those two influencers documented their story, that they were going to fight against each other in a pay-per-view fight. And they really took users along for that journey and built that intrigue and kind of weave the brand into that storytelling in an authentic and natural way. But if it was just like, hey, I went to Chick-fil-A, I don't think it would have worked that well. It had to be tied into a bigger narrative that was, on bigger platforms than just social media. I mean, it was on a pay-per-view platform. Yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about story and then execution. So the F1 series, for example, Emmy caliber execution. So, how are we going to develop that story, but then how are we going to execute? So that's a huge part. I mean, I've seen it go wrong on great ideas. It takes really good teams. So the films that have done really well, the brands understood and got story, and they got where they fit organically into those stories, right? Some certain brands and brand teams aren't going to fit. They're just not going to get it. They're not what we call good clients, and so it's and it's similar too when you're working with studios. Some are going to want to write your ending and going to turn it into a terrible movie, and others be like, hey, you guys shine, you guys are the experts, like show us how it's done. And and that's when we, over 10 years of doing really high level award-winning work, we're working with the kind of artists and DPs and talent that are doing that level. We're talking about Oscar-winning people, that we're working with, or Emmy nominees and people that are high caliber talent in their field of execution and craft. So I think that's also what we bring to the table as well. And I think that what is the battle is that you see a real low level of execution doing a lot on social media. So how do we balance that? And again, all we can go back to is longevity and those bigger pieces that really stand the test of time, that are meaningful, that really can pack an audience. In like my new film, Birth of the End of the Summer, we were going to end on that. Another untold history. And that film is one that, because it has the audience, the built-in audience, there's a certain passion and level there, so of interest. So we know that if we execute that story really well, and we tell this untold story in a super compelling way, that there's an audience there that they're going to want to get in and hear the untold story. And so we're seeing that around the world. When we show up with the film, and we get the word out, we got people waiting in line to get in, so, I until you asked me the question about Birth of the End of the Summer, is it a film about a documentary, and how did you even do that?
Yeah, I can't think of any other example of a documentary about a documentary. It's very meta.
Yeah, so Dick Metz at the center of Birth of the End of the Summer film, which is in select theaters now, and you can look at it, Birth of the Endless Summer on Instagram, Birth of the Endless Summer, at Birth of the Endless Summer on Instagram. It's the story of Dick Metz, and he is is a travel adventure pioneer. Like, he is the original On the Road Jack Kerouac. He is the original Motorcycle Diaries. Like, he is, think of your best travel adventure around the globe from 1958 to 1961, and this man did it. Wow. And he hitchhiked, and he jumped trains, and he conned his way on his ships and became a ship's mate. He went around the world, and the stories are amazing. So his travel adventure is incredible. And Dick Metz was a surfer. So he was a surf pioneer. He was looking for surf around the world, and he found it in Cape St. Francis at South Africa. And if you are fans, those millions and millions and millions of rabid cult-like fans of The Endless Summer, that scene that's the iconic scene in The Endless Summer, Cape St. Francis, Dick Metz discovered it.
Wow.
Not Bruce Brown. So you want to tell the story behind the most watched and beloved documentary of all time, The Endless Summer, you have to start with the original story of the man who inspired the movie. And so it's just remarkable that Dick Metz, when Bruce Brown passed away, to honor The Endless Summer, the only logical thing to do was to tell the untold story behind the inspiration that made The Endless Summer.
Yeah, no, I love it, man. Well, look, the surf industry definitely has seen better days. You know, if you would have told me that Quicksilver would have ended up a licensed brand, I would have told you were insane, 10 years ago. So I think the surf industry could use a good story to get us all feeling a little bit better about ourselves. But as much as there's a lot of challenges and headwinds facing the surf industry, I also think that the revolutions that we're going to see with the wave pool industry is probably going to create surfers and locations. And I mean, who knows? The next world-class champion WSL surfer might come out of a neighborhood in Chicago because of the wave pool industry.
Yeah, it's exciting. And I think it's funny because I think of Paul Hawken again, because in Seeding Change, she talked about the challenges we face environmentally, socially. The issues that we face are so great, but never is there a more exciting time because of this tumultuous present to create solutions, right? I look at the surf industry as just one of many industries. Surfing is an incredible sport that's based in nature, and there's so many stories there and that connect people. And so what was beautiful about The Endless Summer was that it really told a story about this traveling and the connection of cultures through surfing. And that surfing still today is a sport about connecting with each other, about traveling to find these beautiful unridden waves and the kind of family we find at every surf wave. And so with Dick Metz's story and the inspiration in his story and how it inspired Bruce Brown in The Endless Summer, his story is about connection and about cross-generational connection and sharing that love between generations. And so, he was brought in by John Whitmore, who was the Duke Kahanamoku of the sport in South Africa. And he was brought in and he became family with them. And when he got back to California, he shared this news of this place in South Africa where there's amazing people, amazing waves. And so when the young kids who come in and watch Birth of the Endless Summer, they look at surfing as this travel sport, or this sport that connects us and to stories that are important to people, to generations. And that sense of history is that certain sense of meaning. So there's a certain level of deeper purpose that really people are hungry for right now. I think technology is really fast paced. And I think people are really missing a certain human connection. And that the youth that watch this film, Birth of the Endless Summer, people are like, well, why are the young people going to watch a story about a 9-year-old? It's because his stories are so amazing, the way they cross generation. They're such deep stories, and they give us meaning and reason as humans. And surfers or travelers or rock climbers or the next inventor of the next electric boat, it's that same passion, that drive, that purpose, So I think what we're trying to do is tell these stories that inspire, bring people together, and that's where the opportunity is to create positive out of the negative, to take sort of some of these challenges we face in the surf industry or other industries, and like, how can story bring people together and solve problems and create inspiration and hope?
Yeah, I love it, man. Well, hey, we're at an hour and 8 minutes already, so I want to give you some time to plug. So, hey, what are you working on right now? What projects do you have in the development slate where maybe if there's a brand that this is really resonating with them, maybe there's some stuff that people could hop on and get on board with? What do you got coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, well, for one, I mean, I'm really talking to a lot of brands that have environmental and social solutions built into their business models. So I think there's an opportunity to develop story with a few select brands that we have some room in our schedules for. Also, I think too, in looking at entertainment projects, like, does a brand, like you said, do they want to be involved in presenting an hour show on PBS. You know, we have those kind of opportunities too, like potentially talking to Marriott or Hawaiian Air about, as Birth of the and the Summer goes to PBS, do they want to be the part of the group that brings it to air, you know, underwriting. So there's definitely many opportunities, but I think that, you know, the exciting thing is that there's so many opportunities, and that with this market we've identified, with this cautious consumer that we actually really identify in Seeding Change, like cautious consumers need to understand what these brands are doing. And we need to get them these climate solutions, these social justice solutions. We need to communicate with them. So the brands that have these kind of innovations built into their business models, like we need to deliver those stories. So I think that, you know, to end on this idea that the climate crisis is really a communication crisis. That something that Sustainable Brands, when they were presenting us this data from Project Drawdown, like, we have a climate crisis to solve. So for all those brands that have those solutions, we need to work with you, and we need to tell your stories in a compelling way so that we can build movements around those innovations, because we need to scale change fast to solve these problems in a matter of years. Like, we're running out of time, like the stakes are high. So, you know, that's kind of the reality, is that our mission is like, we can work with these brands on the forefront of change. That's where we can do the most difference as storytellers. You know, in Hollywood right now, it seems like every other week there's a Hollywood summit on, like, what's the next impact project? How can we infuse, you know, impact into the new Hollywood scripts that are making the rounds? Like, how are we going to develop story in all forms of entertainment around these innovations, around change, the way thinking about climate and the issues around it. So, you know, I think, again, it's a really challenging time, but it's a great opportunity for us to double down on storytelling, get the word out, because, you know, there are good things happening, right? Like we show in Seeding Change, Amazon is protecting the rainforest with every acai bowl they sell. So, you know, and you got Guayaquil regenerating the North Atlantic rainforest through their model, and so, you know, there's really great stories out there. And, like, so how are we going to, through this story, really change and get people excited and make change with us?
I love it, man. Well, hey, everybody at home, Richard has been generous enough to actually donate a workshop. So if there's any brands out there right now that are watching on LinkedIn or any of the other places that we stream, if you want to go ahead and drop a comment and mention that you'd be interested in Richard's workshop, we're going to pick a brand out of the comments section and give them a little bit of time with Richard so he can walk you through some of the exercises that he does to help you suss out your core values, your story, and maybe get you on the way to creating an amazing piece of content that tells your story, but more importantly, continues and sparks a movement. So with that, Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. When I found out you were a Sigma Chi when I was doing my research today, I like you even more now. So yeah, for everybody that's following along at home, don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you happen to be watching or listening to the podcast today. If you give us a review, that helps us find a more organic audience and gets the show exposed to a bigger group of people. And most importantly, if there's a brand or a marketer out there that you think would benefit from the conversation that I had with Richard today, don't forget to share it with your friends. So, Richard, anything else you want to plug as we sign off here?
Well, I think it's one of the questions you had that we didn't answer was, how has our Sigma Chi relationship, our fraternity relationship, dating all the way back to college, I don't even want to mention dates, how has that brought us together? I think that's the answer to the question. How great that we were able to connect. I mean, there's a chat. All my Sigma Chi brothers from Brown University, there's a chat group. We continually are on chat all the time. And
wow.
Brothers, we cover all industries, so we can pretty much cover all bases. But I was always impressed by how well you are connecting with fellow Sigma Chi members, also how well you're connecting with people across industries. So I'm really glad that we were able to come together and, and now collectively pool our resources in our networks to align and align these causes, and I think that and the whole other conversation is that influencer piece, which you've been really working on the forefront as really, I think, when we talk to brands and we see them really like, do we want to double down on our Taylor Swift, or do we want to think about a feature film, that's going to really, it's like, it's incredible we're having these conversations because it really is like this performance marketing piece. But I think you're going to see a swing from the war, and I'm seeing it in articles that are starting to surface. The brand building piece is really where it's at. And so, and I know from talking to experts and brand storytellers like, Rick Parkhill, that, the brands are seeing the value more and more, and like how these on longer form pieces from 22-minute to hour-long broadcasts to feature films are going to fit into their communications, because that is where we build those stories, right? Again, that really stand the test of time, that have lasting impact, that can build viewerships. And for those brands that are really championing purpose, they're making change in the world, that's that long shelf life to our communications is where it's at. And that kind of flavor of the moment thing that's gone, here and gone so fast, it's not gonna build the kind of movement we need to make change on a scale that we need and the time frame we need to make change for people and planet.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, I couldn't have said it better myself. It was an honor having you on the show, and this is an open invitation. Anytime you have a new project you want to come and talk to the audience about, maybe get some brand support, doors always open. We'd love to have you back on. Yeah,
thanks again, Dylan. Thanks for everyone for sticking out. We've been overextended here, and we could probably go for another hour, but look, I can see people chiming in. Thank you all for coming today, spending the extra time, and it's the beginning of a really exciting chapter, and I'm really excited to see what we do from here, because I think that just working on some of these new projects where we're bringing East and West together through music, and we're discussing heavy topics like the Holocaust. We're talking about things where, not repeating history. I think what we're doing is we're shining spotlight through our purpose-driven storytelling on important, issues that we need to deal with. And as we shine the spotlight on, we find the silver linings, we find that foothold for hope and inspiration. That is how we build a collective positive energy, and that's where we can make anything happen. And that's how we scale it as a collective. So it's exciting times.
Yeah, I love it, man. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on the show. We'll do it again soon, all right?
See you later.